Welcome to this weekend course. And before we jump into the material, let's spend a few minutes just settling down our mind and bringing into our mind a positive intention, a positive motivation for what we're doing here tonight and over the weekend. So I invite you to find a comfortable position. You can sit cross-legged or in a chair. Try to keep your back straight. That helps your mind to be more clear and focused. But at the same time, be relaxed. Try not to have tension, tightness anywhere in your body. If there is any tension, see if you can let it melt and flow away, flow out of you and disappear in the ground beneath you. And let your breathing flow in and out in a natural rhythm without controlling your breathing. And let your mind settle down. That means letting go of thoughts about the past or about the future or other places or problems. So put aside all such thoughts for now. Just let your mind be in the present, right here, right now, focused on what we are doing. So paying attention to your breath flowing in and out, to sensations in your body, is a helpful way of settling the mind in the present, the here and the now. So just do that for a few moments. To make the most of our time together here tonight, bring into your mind a feeling of altruism, kindness, caring for others. So this is something that arises naturally, spontaneously, when we hear about people who are suffering, who are in need, who are going through difficulties. Naturally, we feel concern for them, touched by the difficulties they're experiencing, and wish we could help them to relieve their suffering, restore them to a state of peace and happiness. So see if you can get in touch with that feeling. And it's wonderful to have the wish to help others and to do things that will be beneficial for others. But it's also important to take care of ourselves, take care of our own minds, try to ensure that our minds are in as positive a state as possible. Otherwise, there's the danger that even though we try to help others, if our own emotions come up strongly and get out of control, we might get angry, upset, get into quarrels, conflicts with others, or feel jealous of others. So disturbing emotions can arise in our mind. So it's important that we also take time to take care of our own mind. And that's really what Buddha's teachings are all about. how to work with our mind, how to manage our disturbing thoughts and emotions so they don't take over and lead us into unskillful behavior, and how to increase the positive qualities of the mind, such as compassion, love, wisdom, understanding things as they are, skillful means when it comes to helping others, doing things in the world, and so on. So this is what we're going to be doing tonight and over the weekend, looking at some aspects of Buddhist teachings on how to work on our minds, transform our minds in a positive way, decrease the disturbing aspects of the mind. So see if you can think or feel that you're doing this not just for your own sake, for your own benefit, but so that you can be more beneficial to other people, other beings, and to the world. Okay, so this weekend we're going to be exploring the topic of death and dying. And I taught a course like this last year, about the same time. Some of you may have attended that. And I'll probably be repeating myself. A lot of the things I taught last year, I'll repeat again this year because there's probably people who didn't do last year's course. But there will probably be new things as well that we didn't talk about last year. And even the things we did talk about, it doesn't hurt to hear them again. These topics are so important, and we benefit from hearing them again and again and discussing them, meditating on them, and so on. So I'm always happy when people show an interest in a course like this, because I think it takes some courage to want to explore the topic of death. Just the word death, it's kind of not such a pleasant word, right? It probably brings up certain thoughts or feelings, images, memories that aren't so pleasant. Maybe we want to resist, avoid, run away from. But it's extremely important to look at this topic because it's something that's going to happen to us one day. We ourselves are going to die one day. And even before we die, we will most probably face death by other people who are close to us, people who are important to us, our mothers, fathers, siblings, friends, teachers, and so forth. So people important to us will die, and that will be a challenging experience. But there are things we can do to learn how to manage this whole experience of death, whether our own death or the death of others, that make it not so painful, not so difficult, and even something constructive, something positive, beneficial for our mental development, beneficial for our spiritual development. If we wish to follow the spiritual path and achieve higher states like enlightenment, nirvana, and so on. So there's ways we can deal with difficult experiences like death that help us to grow and help us actually get closer to these higher goals. So it all depends on how we deal with it. Death can be a really difficult, painful, horrible experience, or it could be something beneficial, something positive and constructive. Yesterday, Venerable Kunga asked me some question about if I've had interest in death during my life. And I just mentioned one experience that I had that just popped up immediately. But this morning I was thinking about, many experiences, encounters with death, either in the form of just thoughts about death, questions about death, or actual encounters with death in some way or another. So I had lots of them, and I could see that, they can be very helpful in the sense of directing our life in a certain way. I'll just mention one, which was probably the most powerful experience that I had. It was the first meditation course that I attended in Nepal, Kopan Monastery. This was in 1974. Prior to that, I had spent some months in Dharamsala going to the Tibetan library studying Buddhism. So I'd already learned some Buddhism, and I'd even taken refuge in Bodhisattva vows. I kind of dived right in and, took on a lot. But this was the first time I was doing an actual retreat or meditation course, 1 month long with, all day long teachings and meditations and keeping silence and so on and so forth. So it was quite an intense experience. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche was the main teacher. He was giving most of the teachings during the retreat and sometimes leading meditations as well. So one night we were, the situation of the course at that time, now Kopan is very built up and lots of buildings and so on, but this was back a long time ago, and there were just a few kind of old buildings, and there were 250 people who came for this course. And we had it in a big tent, this kind of big circus tent, which was all rather dilapidated, full of holes that the rain came in and so forth, and straw mats on the ground. And most of the people, there wasn't accommodation for that many people, so most of them were sleeping in the tent. I was fortunate because I had a room in a nearby house, a Nepali house, which was pretty primitive and basic, but at least I had a roof over my head and a little bit of privacy. But yeah, the people who had to sleep in the tent, I really felt sorry for them, especially when it rained. So it was quite kind of intense situation. And toilets, I mean, there were no toilets, just these open pits in the ground with, bamboo panels separating one from another. No showers. I don't know what people did for showers, but anyway, it was really difficult. So challenging experience. Anyway, one night we were in the tent doing meditation. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was sitting on the throne and guiding us in a meditation. And I don't know what we were supposed to be meditating on, but as usual, my mind was just all over the place. And all of a sudden, there was an earthquake. And you really feel it when you're sitting on the ground. And I don't think I'd ever experienced an earthquake before, even though I grew up in California. But this was my first earthquake. And, sitting on the ground, the earth is starting to shake. And Kopan is up on a hill, and it's surrounded by villages, Nepali people, little houses and villages and so on. And we started hearing people screaming, children crying, dogs barking. So it was kind of really scary. And then Lama Zopa Rinpoche suddenly, we'd been in silence for a while, but he suddenly said in a very serious voice, meditate on bodhicitta. And my thought was, this is it. We're going to die. And he's saying that because that's what you're supposed to think before you die. So my mind just went into total panic. I wasn't able to think about bodhicitta or anything positive. It was just fear, just this most horrible experience of fear like I've never felt before. And it was like frozen. I just was frozen in fear, panic. I'm going to die and I don't know what to do and I don't want to die, that kind of thing, And it only lasted, I don't know, a few seconds, maybe a few minutes. Then the shaking stopped and everything became quiet and calm again. People stopped screaming, and so it looked like that wasn't it. I was still alive, to my great relief. But that experience was so powerful for me to see my mind, to see how my mind was in the face of death. Because before that, I thought about death, but I thought, oh, no, you just die and that's it. No big deal. I didn't think I was afraid of death. I really thought that. I really didn't think there was any fear of death. But this experience showed me, oh, there is fear of death. And I'm not prepared for it at all. And I also felt very strongly, I don't want to be like that when I die. I don't want my mind to be like that at the time of death. I want to have something positive, nice, beautiful in my mind, not this horrible feeling of fear and panic. So I had already heard, the teachings in the Lamrim about death and the meditation on death and so on, but this experience made them really alive. I really felt, yes, it's true. I do have to prepare for death. I have to do something with my mind to be able to die with a positive state of mind. So it really gave a lot of power to my interest in study and practice and meditation, and mainly working on my mind. And another experience I had about 10 years after that, I had another kind of near-death experience. This time I was visiting my family in Oregon, and a couple of family members were in the car. We were driving up into the mountains, and it must have been winter because the road was just covered with snow, with ice, actually. I was in the back seat, and my sister and her husband were in the front seat. And we were driving along, maybe probably too fast, because suddenly the car started spinning. And I think it went, 360 degrees. And that was scary. Fortunately, my brother-in-law is a trained airplane pilot, so he knows how to steer and get the car out of that situation. So we were okay. We didn't have a crash. But, for a couple of seconds or minutes, it could have been a really bad crash. We could have been killed. And without thinking, without any conscious thought or, decision, I just found myself reciting Tara mantra. I just took refuge in Tara, and it was just coming out of my mouth, Tara's mantra. So I was very happy to see that I had done enough training, enough familiarity with Dharma practice that it came up like that in such a situation. So hopefully, and now it's many years later, hopefully my mind is trained even better that, even if death does happen in a sudden, unexpected way like that, your familiarity with Dharma, some kind of Dharma practice, even if it's just taking refuge in Buddha or Tara or your guru, will come up to the forefront of your mind instead of just fear and panic and, oh dear, what do I do? And something not so positive. So, encounters with death can be very, very helpful to have us look at what we're doing in our life, what's important to us, what is going on in our mind, and recognize areas that we might need to change, we might need to work on. So even though it's a difficult subject, it's not a pleasant subject, but it is something important to look at. I've heard of people who say, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to talk about it. They just want to totally avoid the whole subject of death and dying. Which I think is understandable. It might just be too scary for them, and they don't know how to deal with it, or it brings up depression. But the fact is, we are going to have to face it one day. And isn't it better to start working on our thoughts and feelings and attitudes about death now, while we still have some time, hopefully, rather than wait till the last minute and then not have any methods at all for being able to deal with it in a positive way? So Buddhism says it is definitely possible to work on our mind, overcome our fears and whatever other disturbing thoughts and emotions we have with regard to death, get those out of the way, and even get to the point where we're able to face death with total calmness and even with cheerfulness, with joy. So that's possible. There are people who are able to die like that. Now, wouldn't that be nice? Nicer than fear, panic. Yeah. So one reason why we might have fear or discomfort or difficulties with regard to the whole topic of death could be that we have certain misconceptions or unrealistic attitudes about death and dying. And we might even hold such attitudes without even knowing it. They might just be kind of part of our makeup, things that we've picked up from our family or our society. And so they're just there, but we're not fully aware of them. And yet they govern our thoughts and our feelings and our behavior. And so I thought to start with talking about what Buddhism says about death, some of the ideas and attitudes found in Buddhism with regard to death, because hearing about these might help us to recognize certain attitudes in ourself that might not be helpful or realistic, and make a comparison, a contrast. So, by the way, those who are watching online, I'm mainly going to be using this little booklet. You don't have this booklet, but there is a PDF version of it. So it's called Preparing for Death and Helping the Dying. So I put this together when I was living in Singapore during the 90s and started teaching courses like this because there seemed to be a real need for it. And so this booklet was put together by myself and my friends there. And I like the booklet. I'm quite happy with it. And so we'll be using this as the main basis for this course. And so you can get a PDF file of it. If you don't have it yet, you can get it afterwards. I'll just start talking about it tonight. But the first section of the book is talking about Buddhist perspectives on death. So I'm going to go through these tonight. And some of you probably heard these before. They're not necessarily new. But again, it doesn't hurt to hear them again and then compare them with our own thoughts and feelings and experiences with regard to death. So one thing Buddhism says about death is that it's just natural. It's a natural, inevitable part of life. Now that may seem obvious, but I've heard some people have strange ideas. For example, that death is some kind of punishment for things you've done wrong. Have you ever heard of that idea? Yeah. That I don't know if people just come up with this on their own or they might even hear it from other people. I think it's probably more likely to happen if, for example, you're not that old. You might be in your 30s or 40s or 50s and you're diagnosed with cancer or some other terminal disease. And you might think, wait a minute, this shouldn't be happening to me. I'm too young to die. What did I do wrong? Right? Maybe God's unhappy with me, punishing me. The universe is punishing me. So I think this idea can sometimes come up in people's mind, or they may hear it from, I don't know, other people, New Age ideas. And so according to Buddhism, that's not true. Death isn't a punishment. It's something that happens to everybody. Everybody. Even the Buddha himself came to the end of his life and passed away. And all the great saints, Jesus and Muhammad and so on, saints of all religious traditions, they all had to die. It's just natural. Like the Buddha said in one of his sutras, whatever is born will die. Yeah. So just being born, coming into the world, coming into life means eventually, inevitably, we will die. Every being who is born will eventually die. So it's not a punishment. Another thing people might sometimes think is it's a sign of failure. I'm a loser. I'm a failure. What did I do wrong? So if you have those kinds of thoughts, like you're being punished or you're a loser, you're a failure, it's just going to make it worse, right? It's on top of, having to face the end of your life, to have those kinds of thoughts or attitudes, it's just going to make your suffering worse rather than better. So if you do have any ideas like that, investigate them and check to see if it's true or not. And there's a lovely story from the time of the Buddha that illustrates the inevitability of death. and how important it is to accept it and acknowledge it. There was a woman named Kisa Gotami, and she was married, but it wasn't a very happy marriage. I think she probably had problems with her in-laws, as many people do. So it wasn't such a happy situation. But then she gave birth to a child, a little baby boy, and she adored her child. It was like the center of her life, the source of much joy for her. But then when this child was still a baby, maybe a year old or less, he died. And she was just overcome with grief and the inability to accept. And so she took her baby in her arms and just went around the village where she lived. Whoever she met, she would say, "Please, can you bring my baby back to life?" And people were very sorry for her, but nobody knew what to do to help her. Finally, someone suggested that she go and see the Buddha. I think the Buddha was in that neighborhood at that point in time. So they said, "Why don't you go and talk to him?" So she approached the Buddha and asked the same question. "Please, can you bring my baby back to life?" And he said, "I will help you, but you need to bring me some mustard seeds." Mustard seeds are a common ingredient in Indian cooking. So every household has mustard seeds. But he said, "But you have to get them from a house where nobody has died." So she went off and started knocking on people's doors and asked for mustard seeds. Everybody had mustard seeds. But then when she asked, "But has anybody died in this house?" "Oh, no, our grandfather died last week. Oh, no, we lost a child. So every single house had experienced a death, a loss. She wasn't able to find a single house where there wasn't somebody who died. So slowly it dawned on her that death is something that happens to everybody, every family, every person. And accepted the loss of her own child, went back to the Buddha and told him of her discovery. Then she buried her child and asked the Buddha to take her as a disciple. So she began practicing meditation under the guidance of the Buddha. And I think the story is she actually became an arhat. She reached nirvana in that life. I might be wrong about that. But anyway, she definitely achieved a much better state of mind than previously. So that's kind of a lovely story that illustrates a skillful teaching of the Buddha, skillful way of dealing with someone in their grief, but just the inevitability of death. It's of course extremely tragic when it happens to a child. It's not so surprising or upsetting when it happens to somebody in their 90s or over 100, but a small child. But it does happen. That's the fact of it. That's the reality of it. So it's helpful to contemplate this point and just gradually come to accept that it's something that happens to all of us. And accepting the inevitability of death is also a way that helps us to be more at peace with it. Because otherwise, if we resist it, if we see it as a punishment or a sign of failure or something wrong, something out of the norm, and we're always trying to fight it, then that will just make things worse. That'll make it harder for us to just accept the reality of death when it is happening to us or to one of our loved ones. Does that make sense? Yeah, how important it is just to accept it. That doesn't mean we just stop trying to keep ourselves alive and let ourselves die. Of course, life is important and precious, and we do need to take care of ourselves and try to keep ourselves alive as long as possible. But sooner or later, something is going to happen that will cause our death. And when everything has been done to keep ourselves alive and nothing more can be done, and it really does look like it's time to go, then it's much better to accept it and acknowledge it. Another point about death in Buddhism is the real meaning of death is it's the point when our mind separates from our body. So actually, Venerable Children talked about this, the first teaching in this series that she's going through. So that was 2 days ago, Wednesday morning, 15th. She talked quite a bit about the Buddhist view of what a human being is, what a living being is, and how we are basically made up of a body and a mind, the body being all the physical, material parts of us, and then our mind being non-physical, non-material, consciousness, awareness, which isn't physical at all. It isn't part of the brain or a property, a product of the brain. It's something else completely. So while we're alive, our body and our mind are like married. They abide together in a very interdependent relationship, depend on each other, affect each other, and so on. But at a certain point, that they have a divorce. It's time to separate. So that's what death is all about. Death is the point at which the mind, the consciousness, separates from the physical body. And the Tibetan tradition, I think Tibetan Buddhism probably has more information about death and dying, what actually happens when we die, how to deal with the whole situation of death and dying. More information than any other religious tradition, even any other Buddhist tradition. So I think Tibetan Buddhism is really rich in its information about this topic. So we'll look at that later, tomorrow or the next day, the process of dying as it's explained in Buddhism, how it actually happens. It isn't just like that, but it's a it's a process. And but then at the end of that process, the mind separates from the body. And this isn't something that's visible. We can't see it with our eyes. Scientists are not able to measure it. They don't have any instruments that are able to detect the presence of the mind, the qualities of the mind. Their scientific instruments are only able to detect physical phenomena, but not non-physical phenomena, as far as I know. So that's why there's a lot of skepticism that there is such a thing as mind or consciousness other than the body. And I do understand it's difficult for many people to believe the Buddhist explanation of the mind. But there are sources of information that can help to open our mind up more to this, such as stories of people who are able to remember past lives. Also near-death experiences. There's actually a lot of people who have. I've met some of them myself. People who have had some kind of experience of dying, like heart attack, cardiac arrest, or being in a car accident. So for a period of time, their body is not alive. Their heart's not beating, brain is stopped, and so on. So it appears as if they're dead. But then after some time, they revive, they come back to life again. But during that period of time when they were as if dead, they had experiences. And some of these experiences can be quite extraordinary. And in fact, there's a doctor in Holland, Pim van Lommel. Have you heard of him? He's a cardiologist, and while he was working as a cardiologist, some of his patients who'd had heart attacks or cardiac arrests would talk to him about experiences they had during that period of time. And he was really intrigued because, according to his education, when a person has died, there's no brain activity, so there should be no conscious experiences during that period of time. And yet people who did have conscious experiences. So he said, how is this possible? So he got so interested, he decided to stop practicing cardiology and go into research on near-death experiences. And he and a number of colleagues spent 15 years doing research, very thorough scientific research into near-death experiences. And then he published his findings in a book. It was originally in Dutch, but it's been translated into English. I didn't read the book, but I've read interviews with him. And also his work was published in a very prestigious journal called The Lancet. I think in England. So it got quite a bit of attention, a lot of skepticism and criticism, but it's difficult to knock what he found, that there are people who die, everything stops, everything shuts down, and yet they still have experiences during that period of time. And some of the experiences people have like that, they actually find themselves outside of their body. Like if the body's in the operating room or in an emergency room, ICU, whatever, the body is there, and the person is like up on the ceiling or over in the corner and just watching what's going on. They're looking at their body and they're looking at the doctors and nurses trying to revive them and whatever. And then they come back into their body and they're able to describe what was done. Okay, so then you can't say, well, this is just fantasy, hallucination, because they are describing actual experiences that took place that can be verified. So that becomes very difficult to explain if you say that mind consciousness is solely produced by the brain, but here's a person having experiences when the brain has stopped, shut down, not operating. So anyway, this is, if you are skeptical or have a doubt about, the mind, the consciousness being something other than the brain or something other than a product of the brain, this is something you can look into. But anyway, the Buddhist view is we do have mind or consciousness, which is not part of the body. It's separate from the body and yet interdependent with the body while we're alive. Body and mind work together while we're alive. But then at a certain point, mind leaves, and that's death. Once the mind has left the body isn't able to do anything anymore. No breathing, no heartbeat, no brain activity, and it starts to decay. It starts to, get smelly. It's time to do something with the body. So then when the mind leaves the body, what does it do? Well, as long as we're ordinary beings, we haven't reached enlightenment, we haven't reached nirvana, it'll take another rebirth. Yeah. So then we get into the whole topic of rebirth, another huge topic. And I'm talking about this because this is one reason, probably the main reason why death is such an important topic in Buddhism, and in particular Tibetan Buddhism. Because if this life is all there is, and when we die, everything ceases, our mind ceases, nothing continues, then, it doesn't matter so much what we do with our life. We can sort of just have fun and enjoy ourselves as much as possible, make as much money as possible, because it's all going to end anyway when we die. However, even the Dalai Lama, I read one book, I was really surprised to read this. The Dalai Lama said, if there was no continuation of consciousness after death, then I'd probably just spend my life, enjoying myself and drinking and smoking and having a good time. Because, why do spiritual practice? I mean, of course, it helps us to be more happy, but, we don't need to put that much energy into spiritual practice, like trying to achieve these higher states of mind if our mind's just going to cease when we die. But that's really the conclusion that you would come to, if we only have this one life, 80, 90, 100 years or whatever, and that's it, well, okay, you just make the best of it, enjoy yourself as much as possible, but no need to really put that much energy into spiritual practice and development of the mind. But according to Buddhism, that isn't the case. Our mind will continue after this life and will most probably take another life, another rebirth. And the circumstances of our next life, where we're born, what experiences we have, and so on and so forth, mainly depend on how we live our life, what we do with our life. Basically, we need to behave ourselves, do good things, and avoid bad things in order to have a fortunate rebirth in the next life. And so realizing that this life is temporary, transitory, it's going to end at some point, our mind is going to carry on, then if you think about that, you can see how important it is to take care of the mind. I mean, of course, we need to take care of our body and so on, but mind is more important because our body has a limited lifespan. It's only going to last a certain number of years, where our mind is going to last a long time. So there's a story. I'll read this story. It's kind of sweet. This is a story from the Buddha. I don't know if you'll enjoy it or not, but anyway, here it is. In the time of the Buddha, there was a rich merchant who had 4 wives. This was common at that time. You could have more than one wife. 4 wives. So he loved the 4th wife the most and adorned her with rich robes and treated her to delicacies. He took great care of her and gave her nothing but the best. He also loved the 3rd wife very much. He was very proud of her and always wanted to show her off to his friends. However, the merchant was always in great fear that she might run off with another man. He loved the 2nd wife also. She was a very considerate person, always patient, and in fact was the merchant's confidant. Whenever the merchant faced problems, he always turned to his 2nd wife, and she would always help him out and helped him get through difficult times. The merchant's 1st wife was a very loyal partner and made great contributions in maintaining his wealth and business, as well as taking care of the household. However, the merchant didn't love his 1st wife, and in fact hardly paid any attention to her. One day the merchant fell ill, and before long he knew that he was going to die soon. He thought of the luxurious life that he had lived and thought to himself, "Here I have 4 wives who loved me and who I cared for, but when I die I will be alone. How lonely I will be." So he asked the 4th wife, "I loved you the most, endowed you with the finest clothing and showered great care on you. Now that I'm dying, will you come with me and keep me company?" "No way," replied the 4th wife. And she walked away without another word. The answer was like a sharp knife that struck right into the merchant's heart. The sad merchant then said to the 3rd wife, "I loved you so much all my life. Now that I am dying, will you follow me and keep me company?" "No," replied the 3rd wife. "Life is so good here. I'm going to remarry after you die." Hearing this, the merchant's heart sank and turned cold. Then he asked the 2nd wife, "I always turn to you for help, and you always help me out. Now I need your help again. When I die, will you follow me and keep me company?" "I'm sorry, I can't help you out this time," replied the 2nd wife. "At the very most, I can only accompany you to the crematorium, or the graveyard." The answer came like a bolt of thunder, and the merchant was stunned. "I will go with you. I will follow you no matter where you go." The merchant looked up, and in front of him was his 1st wife. She was very thin and malnourished. Greatly grieved, the merchant said, "I should have taken care of you while I could." Therefore, the Buddha said, the 4th wife is like our body. No matter how much time and effort we spend taking care of it and making it look good, it cannot go with us when we die. The 3rd wife is like our possessions, status, and wealth. When we die, doesn't our property go to others? Don't others take over our positions? The 2nd wife is like our family and friends. No matter how much they had been there for us while we were alive, the furthest they can go with us when we die is the crematorium or the graveyard. The 1st wife is like our mind, which we have neglected life after life in our pursuit of material and sensual pleasure. Our mind is the only thing that accompanies us wherever we go. Hence, we should start to cultivate and practice now, rather than wait until we're on our deathbed to lament, I should have taken care of you while I could. So that's a nice story to illustrate. Yeah, and most people, are like the merchant. They mainly take care of their body, building up your muscles and doing all these amazing things with your body, keeping it fit and healthy and young looking as much as possible. But, you can only do that so long, and eventually it's going to turn into a corpse. I mean, face it. What this is a living corpse. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? But that's the reality. And then our possessions and wealth and status, positions, job and so forth. So we also put a lot of time and energy into taking care of those things, but they too will be left behind when we die. We can't take any of it with us. We have that expression in English, right? You can't take it with you. And so it's really true. Of course, we need to take care of these things while we're alive, but if we spend too much time, too much energy, and neglect our mind, taking care of our mind, then this man will come to the end of our life and feel regret. And then friends and family, of course, they are very important while we're alive, but the tendency is to be very attached and clinging to them, not think about the fact that these relationships will come to an end. We don't want to think about that, right? You don't want to think, I'm going to die or they're going to die, we're going to separate. And we try to avoid thinking about that. Or if the thought comes up, no, we cling even harder. But it is important to accept those relationships are not going to last forever. At some point in time, we will have to separate from those people. It's much better to prepare ourselves for that now while we're alive, because otherwise there's a lot of grief, a lot of sadness, a lot of mental pain at the time of death, which is unnecessary. It doesn't need to be like that. So the only thing that does continue after death is our mind. So it's very, very important to take care of our mind. Dalai Lama often talks about this as well. He calls it mental hygiene. Yeah, he says we take so much care of our body, physical hygiene, and of course it is important to take care of our body, our health, our hygiene. But our mind is also important. Mental hygiene, keeping our mind healthy and clear and positive. So that brings us to the next point. Buddhism says it's important to accept, acknowledge death, and think about it while we're still alive. Some people might think it's morbid to dwell on death and think about death. But it depends on how we think about it, in what way we're thinking about it. Of course, you're just letting your mind be haunted by it, or maybe having a kind of perverted interest in death and violence and weapons and horror movies and all those kind of things. That's not so healthy. But in Buddhism and most religions, in fact, the interest in death is more just accept that it's going to happen. It could happen any time, and that there's need to prepare ourselves for it. So that's a healthy way of thinking about it. So why that is so important in Buddhism? One reason is it will help us to become more careful about what we do, about our actions. Now, from the Buddhist point of view, this is because, as I mentioned before, it's our actions, our karma in this life that mainly create our next life. Where we're going to go, what kind of body we have, what kind of situation we're born in, what kind of family, what kind of experiences. We're creating our next life right now by the way we live this life. The next life is just a continuation of this life. And it's our karma, our actions that are responsible for that. And naturally, we want good experiences, be born in a good situation, not have terrible, painful experiences. So if that's the case, we need to make sure we do the right things. We create the right causes for fortunate rebirth, fortunate experiences. So we'll get into that more later. But it's basically good karma, creating good karma, trying to avoid bad karma, and purifying whatever bad karma we do create. Another reason it is important to contemplate death, to be aware of death while we're still alive, is because the state of mind that we are in at the time of death is very important, very crucial. That's another factor that influences where we are born in our next life. So part of it is the karma we create during our life, but another important factor is what state of mind we have when we die. Because at the end of our life, we're going to have lots of karma. Our mind is just going to be chock-a-block full of different kinds of karma, some good, some bad. And we also have karma from previous lives as well that we're still carrying with us. So there's a whole mass of karma in there. So which karma is going to be the one that throws our mind into the next life? Well, that will depend on the state of mind we have as we die. If we die with a positive state of mind, if we're able to feel peaceful, accepting, if we're able to think of the Buddha, some objects of refuge, if we have love and compassion, so some kind of positive, virtuous state of mind, that will enable a good karma to arise, ripen, and be the cause for our next life, which will be in a good situation. On the other hand, if we die with a not so positive state of mind, for example, if we're angry, which does happen. I've heard some people die angry that they're dying, angry at their spouse for things they did or didn't do, angry at the doctors, angry at everybody, at the world. So that would be a very unfortunate state of mind to have at the time of death. Another would be attachment, just clinging, feeling so sad about what you're leaving behind, who you're leaving behind, not wanting to leave those things behind. So strong attachment and clinging and grasping, it's also not a positive state of mind. And fear would be another one. That's a very disturbed state of mind. So if our mind is in a disturbed state as we're dying, that's like the fertile ground for one of our bad karmic seeds to rise to the surface and then be the propelling force for the next rebirth in an unfortunate situation. So it's very important to be able to die with a positive state of mind. And to be able to have a positive state of mind while we're dying, we need to acquaint ourselves with positive states of mind while we're alive. We need to learn how to do that, how to get into a positive state of mind, how to keep our mind positive as much as possible. So if we practice that while we're alive, then it'll be easy, natural at the time of death. Whereas if we don't ever try to do that while we're alive and we just hope our mind will be in a good state at that moment, it's a bit unlikely. Yeah. So from the Buddhist point of view, that's the most important thing, the most important aspect of dying is being able to die with a positive state of mind. And this isn't just Buddhism. When I was in Singapore, I was invited to give a talk at a hospice. And they had arranged a kind of seminar for their hospice volunteers. And because these volunteers were going into hospitals and hospices and homes, dealing with different kinds of people from different religious backgrounds. So they wanted their volunteers to be acquainted with different religions' views about death and dying and what was important. So they asked me to represent Buddhism, and then there was a Christian minister and a Hindu Swami, I think, and then a woman from some Islamic organization. So each of us gave a talk about how death is viewed in our respective religion and what's important to when you're helping someone of that religion as they are dying. And it was wonderful to hear. We all said the same thing, basically. Yeah, the important thing, the bottom line is help the person be in a positive state of mind. Yeah, remind them of their religious beliefs, help them stay calm, help them to not be attached to this life. So it's basically the same thing. I thought that was really lovely. So in all religious and spiritual traditions, it's considered very, very important to have a positive, peaceful state of mind. And I think even if people don't believe in a future life, even if you believe that death is just complete end of everything, nothing continues, still, if you ask yourself, what state of mind do I want to have at that time? Do I want to die angry or full of fear or full of regret and sadness and guilt about all the mistakes I made in my life, or attachment to everybody? Probably not. Yeah. So even if you think death is just the end, you probably want to end it on a good note, right? In a good state of mind. Peaceful and loving, feeling love for your family and friends and who's ever around you, forgiving your enemies, right? So I think for anybody, whether they believe in a future life or not, it's important to be able to die with a positive state of mind. And it is possible. We need to prepare ourselves during our life. And that's a big part of this weekend course, is how to do that, how to do things during our life to be able to increase the chances or even ensure that our mind will be in a positive state as we die. Okay, another point. Death isn't necessarily a bad experience, so we don't have to be afraid of it. I think a lot of people are afraid of death. I am. I'm still kind of scared of death. I think it's quite natural to have fear of death. But do we need to be afraid of death? Is it right to be afraid of death? Why are we afraid of death? It's really good to look at that, to consider that. And there's actually stories of people. You may know people yourself or have heard stories of people who do come to the end of their life and go through the experience of death and have an easy time of it. They're not frightened. They're not freaked out. They're quite peaceful and calm. So I think that's why we're afraid. We're afraid it's going to be a horrible experience. But is that necessarily the case? I don't think so. And this is a book called The Zen of Living and Dying by Philip Kapleau. And I actually read this book long ago, before there were any other books about Buddhism and death. And it's been revised recently. So Philip Kapleau he's passed away now, but he was a Zen teacher in Rochester, New York, taught for about 45 years or more. So this has some very interesting material in it. He kind of brings in things from other sources. So he's mentioning a book about death by a biologist named Lyle Watson. Have you heard of him? Anyway, he says in this book, not all cultures fear death and therefore deny it as ours does. So fear of death isn't necessarily universal. It isn't the case that every people, every culture in the world fears death. So this biologist says, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that fear is a natural and inevitable part of our dying behavior. On the contrary, he writes, in cultures where death is dealt with more openly and seen as part of the living process, there is no fear of death. He also says that he does not know of a single organism that manifests a natural fear of death itself. When terminal patients have had enough time or have been given enough of the right kind of help to conquer their fears and accept the inevitability of dying, they often experience feelings of peace and contentment. And then he has a quotation from Socrates, who says that fear of death is unnatural, because it's grounded in the egotistic notion that one knows what one does not know. In other words, if you're afraid of death, that means you know that death is going to be a bad experience. And how do you know that? It means you think you know more than you really do. So it's kind of a, egotistical thing. He says, no man knows whether death may not even turn out to be the greatest of blessings for a human being. And yet people fear it as if they knew for certain that it is the greatest of evils. That was Socrates. And then he talks about how, according to Buddhism, ego plays a big part in it. Just our sense of self, our sense of ego. So he says, from a Buddhist perspective, the key to dispelling the fear of death is the loosening of the fetters of the ego. And how we can do that, how we can loosen the fetters of the ego, one way is by being less self-centered and more altruistic. He says, we forego indulging our own desires and rather support the group effort, whether the group be our own family, fellow workers, friends, neighbors, or even country or monastery. So, decreasing your sense of self-centeredness and me, I am the most important, and putting more into the group, others. So that's a helpful way of reducing the ego and thus having less fear of death. Anyway, so it's questionable, something to consider, whether fear of death is inevitable, necessary, or not. And I don't think it is. Yeah, and I was with my mother when she passed away. I'll tell that story later, but I was quite amazed at how calm she was, how peaceful she was, how unafraid she was. And I think it was mainly because of her strong religious beliefs and practices that she had all during her life and continued during her death. So it is definitely possible to overcome fear of death and be able to face death with peacefulness. And then finally, one more point Buddhism says about death is it's possible to reach a point where we are free of death and rebirth. So although Buddhism says we have been on this wheel of life and death without beginning, we've experienced many deaths already and many rebirths. So it's not a new experience, and we just keep going around and around in this cycle of death and rebirth. But there is an end to this. And the Buddha himself achieved this state and taught the way to do it. Nirvana, the state of nirvana, state of liberation from death and rebirth and suffering. And it's actually called the deathless state. I think in some sutras that's a synonym, the deathless state. We don't have to die anymore. And then, of course, enlightenment, Buddhahood. So when achieving those states, one no longer has to go through death and rebirth. And one is free to just put all of one's energy into benefiting others, helping others.
There's 2 questions so far. The first is, do near-death experiences in dreams count as near-death experiences?
Near-death experiences in dreams. I haven't heard of that before. Because usually a near-death experience means your body actually stops. Your life stops for a period of time, either due to a heart attack or while going through an operation or a car accident. So everything kind of stops. Life stops for a period of time and then starts again. So how would that happen in a dream? You mean you're just dreaming that you die and go out of your body? I haven't heard of that.
Maybe they'll write more about that.
Okay.
And then some people want to know, what's the source of the 4 wives story? What's
I
sutra?
don't know. I just found it on my computer. I have a whole folder with all this material about death and dying, and I found it on there. I probably got it from somewhere in Singapore. I'll try to look it up, but I just think it's a nice story.
And well, were you still here in the fall when Geshe Dado was here?
Sorry?
Were you here in the fall when Geshe Dado was teaching?
Last fall?
Yeah.
No, I think I was gone.
So he was talking about near-death experiences at one point too. And I asked him about at what point in the dissolution might this happen. And there was some discussion. And then Venerable Children piped up and she said that she remembered His Holiness saying that once the mind leaves the body, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
The mind doesn't go back in. So I'm wondering if you've heard or have thoughts about when this near-death thing might be happening.
No, but my understanding is like hers, that there's no coming back. Once the mind has totally separated from the body, it doesn't come back. So I don't know. Yeah. And I don't know if anyone has tried to explore this. I mean, definitely the person hasn't completely died, because according to the Tibetan explanation of the 8 stages of the death process, I mean, it's a little complicated, but, that's something that could take days, could go on for days. It could be instant, like in the case of a heart attack or accident, car accident or plane crash, it could be right away. But in the case of a natural death, death from illness or death from old age, it could go for several days. So, yeah, I mean, people have these experiences where, for example, they, see themselves going through a tunnel, and then they meet this being of light and have some sort of interaction with this being. And so, I mean, it could be partway through the process of dying, the stages, but not all the way to the 8th stage. But it's difficult to know for sure. You'd probably take a yogi who has clairvoyance and can look into the person's mind and know exactly where they're at.
You're saying it's so important to die peacefully and, with the mind of bodhicitta best. If your practice is not that advanced yet, and you're not even talking about tantric practices, what do you think about a certain form of medication? There are medications that make apparently the mind so peaceful. Like I remember my mother, she was so peaceful dying, and because of support of medication, because she had pain too. So and medication that doesn't dilute too much the mind, not sure.
Mm-hmm. What do I think about this? I don't know that much about different kinds of medications that can be given or are given as a person is dying. I mean, I guess there are concerns. People who are religious practitioners often have the concern about being conscious so they can do their final prayers or their final practices, final meditations and so on. So they don't want to be just totally unconscious or hallucinating at that time. But my understanding is, and Venerable Jigme can maybe say something about this, that it is possible to take a certain dosage, a certain amount of medication that reduces pain so that you're not, because, I mean, if you're in excruciating pain, then that would make it difficult to do your meditation and prayer. You just be, totally focused on the pain. So somewhere in between, enough medication that the pain is manageable, reduced and manageable, but there's still clarity and consciousness to be able to do whatever practices you want to do. That's possible, Venerable Jigme.
My experience with people dying in the hospital, if their mind is quite uncontrolled, even when you give strong medicine, their mind often will stay uncontrolled and they will die in a very difficult way, very painful maybe angry or, thrashing about or whatever. If a person works with their mind, then they, like you said, they may need some medicine to take the edge off the pain so that they can manage okay. And, I've seen people that are riddled with much disease, and yet their mind is just joyful. I remember one experience back in the 80s with a young man who was dying of AIDS, and the last conversation that he had, I was in the room, and he said, "Do you see it?" And I said, "Well, no, describe it for me." And he said, "Well, there's the stairs." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, what are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to go up them now." And I said, "Okay, that sounds good." And then he died, and with a smile on his face, and it was a beautiful, experience. So,
Stairway to heaven.
yeah. So,
Hopefully. Yeah.
Just two more questions. It's kind of similar to what we've been talking about. Someone is saying their father passed away in the ICU on comfort care. He had a lot of morphine on board when he passed. How did that affect his karma?
Don't ask me. I don't know if morphine would affect your karma. What affects your karma is your state of mind. And it's difficult to know unless you have clairvoyance, especially if the person is unconscious. You don't know what's going on in their mind. Actually, I was just reading something. I'll read it again and bring it tomorrow. But somebody who worked in a hospice had interviewed a number of lamas in Dharamsala. And one of the questions was about medication. And one of the high lamas actually said something kind of nice about medication. Like he didn't think it would be a problem to take medication. But I'll bring it, I'll look for it and bring it tomorrow. Because some lamas, it almost sounds like, no, don't take any medication. Not good for you. But yeah, there's medication and there's medication. So I think if it's not just totally zonking you out and maybe causing hallucinations, that would be really unfortunate. But just reducing your pain, making your pain manageable, I can't see how that would be wrong or adversely affecting your karma.
Okay, and then the next question is, at the point of death, what shall we meditate on as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner at the beginning, mid, and advanced levels? This is from Singaporeans.
Well, that's a big question. But I'm going to be talking tomorrow about actual practices that could be done to, we prepare ourselves while we're alive. We train ourselves in these practices. We get used to doing them until they become just so easy, so natural, like second nature. And then, that's what we'll be able to bring up in our mind at the time of death. So that's a big question, and there's not time for that now. So it'll come over the course of the weekend.
Just again, going back to the question of pain. Now, of course, the process of dying has varying lengths of time, and controlling or minimizing the pain for a portion of that time could be very helpful for someone. And, but with the dissolution process of the actual sense faculties, and which you haven't described yet, but just that there is this dissolution process, and that the actual tactile, sensory faculties also stops working before the moment of death. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the steps in the process. So would we say then that for a person who's already reached the dissolution of their tactile sense, that they necessarily wouldn't have any pain after that point, physical pain?
Yeah, again, one of the lamas mentioned that, that at a certain point, that particular sensory experience will stop, will cease, so then there won't be any more pain. But that's, I think, stage number 4. So you have a few stages to go through before you get to that one. So it's kind of halfway through the whole process. So
But
yeah.
it's like no one actually would die in pain. That kind of physical pain.
Well, no, but then if you are in excruciating pain, and I mean, I know myself, when I'm in pain, it's very hard to keep a happy mind. So your mind could get quite negative, quite, not in a good state. So, if that's the state of mind you have before you get to the point where there is no more pain, that could still leave some effect and influence the state of mind. So I think, it's good to find some way to reduce the pain. Either work on it with your meditation practice, because that's possible too. I read this when I was in Singapore. I read this little book written by a monk, a Malaysian monk, I think, about death and dying, and he told a story in there of a woman, a Malaysian woman, who was a housewife and mother, and she had only started doing meditation for about a year before she was diagnosed with cancer, lung cancer. And she had learned Vipassana meditation, insight meditation, and also metta meditation, loving kindness. And so then she went through this experience with cancer, various operations and medications and so on for a number of years, and nothing worked. Nothing was able to cure her of cancer. So eventually she died. But she was very determined to use meditation rather than medication when dealing with pain. And apparently she did sometimes have incredible pain. She'd even be writhing on the floor, but she didn't want to take any medication. And so she was just using her practice, mindfulness, paying attention, moment by moment, whatever was happening. And it said that before she died, she got to a place where there was no more pain. Pain just stopped. She was just peaceful and even blissful, glowing, radiant. Her family was around. I think she had some young children, but she wasn't attached to them. She was just radiating this love and compassion. So she was just in this amazing state of mind as she died, just through her practice of meditation. And I just found that really inspiring. She wasn't like a lama or a monk or a nun who'd been meditating for years and years and years and years, just kind of an ordinary person. But she just had this very strong determination to practice, to use the practice of meditation in dealing with her experiences. And it paid off. I mean, I don't know if anyone was able to determine what state she was in or what stage she had realized, but she seemed to have gotten quite a high level of realization. So it is possible with meditation to get beyond pain, or at least manage pain and not be bothered by it. So we'll start again tomorrow morning and start looking at some of the practices we can do to prepare ourselves for death and be able to die with a more peaceful, positive state of mind.